So we shall continue reviewing the book by Will Durant. The book entitled The Case for India. The book was written in 1930 when Will Durant, the American historian and philosopher, he came to India to collect material for his magnum opus, his huge book on civilization. He has written an 11-volume book on civilization, the history of civilization. And in that, the very first one was about the East, the Oriental heritage, mainly India. So he came to India to collect material, and he was shocked by the state of affairs prevalent in India at that time. And he was so moved that he said that he should write a book on the present day India before he ventures on the cultural heritage of this country. So he wrote this book, which is a small book of about 150 pages, but very pithy, very meaningful, and very educative for Indians, because it very poignantly bring to focus the problem of India as against the British rulers. India was locked in a struggle for freedom, and more than that, just the struggle, more than that, it is about the history, the 200 years of history under the British rule that had reduced India to a very pathetic situation, pathetic condition. And Will Durant was very much moved about it. So he said, I should document this. And in very strong words and very crisp phrases, he wrote a small book, but very pithy and useful book. So we started reviewing it in the last session, and one session we completed, and we covered 3-4 subtitles, the background, and the manner in which the East India Company conquered India, the bribe and perfidy. Then, having conquered, their taxation policy, which reduced India to an economic wreck, the economic destruction. These things we have seen. And along with economic destruction, it has also reduced it into an illiterate country. India was known for its education system, its knowledge. Indian culture is a knowledge-centric culture. But here, India was reduced to a bare literacy. It is only about 4% of the people were literate in 1930, as reported by Will Durant. Today we shall continue this discussion or this review of this book. There are several subtitles, small units. One is about education, another is how the British encouraged opium and alcohol. A country which is addicted to opium is bound to degenerate and decay, and it would be easy to rule such a country. So the British government, British Raj, systematically promoted opium and alcohol consumption among the public. Then the result of their taxation policy and their policy on industry led to the destruction of the Indian economy, both on the agricultural side and also on the industrial side, reducing vast majority of this country to abject poverty, and which led to famines in the country. Not only the grain output was reduced because the agriculture suffered. But more than that, the poverty, the buying power of the populace was reduced to abject proportions that they were victims of famines. Naturally, once the food intake is affected, it will result in malnutrition, disease, and the consequence is death. Apart from that, we will also see the political angle, the policy of the government, how they try to keep control over India, the colonial grip, and they claimed that they are doing a great service to India. And they said that we have given them a rule of law, as if India had no rule of law. And then finally, what Will Durant has to say as his final opinion and indictment, we will see that. Regarding education, the institutions suffered because the economic system was centralized and the government would not support the institutions. Earlier, there was at least one school per village. India is a country of more than 7 lakh 30,000 villages, as Will Durant records it. And each village had a school. And by the time he came in 1930, the number of schools, that is not the old schools, the new schools and the old schools put together, the total number of schools in the country had reduced to something like 1,60,000. That means most of the schools had stopped functioning, had collapsed because their economic source had dried up, because they were all dependent upon local economy, the village level economy, and the village level economy was destroyed completely by the new system of taxation, which was more than 50% at times. And the money was not allowed to be retained in the village level. It was centralized and it was absorbed by the Raj. And therefore the institutions suffered. That is on one hand. And on the other hand, the economic level of the populace was reduced to such a level where they could not afford to send the children to school. For both the reasons. One is that the school was too heavily priced for them. They could not meet the expenses. Another is they needed the support of their children to sustain themselves, even for bare requirements of food and clothing. And any attempt by the Indian public, the leaders of Indian public, to improve education was defeated by the government. In fact, when you say the Indian leaders had some representation in their councils, the Viceroy's Council, the Constituent, the Legislative Assembly, that kind of thing. There were some representation to select individuals from the Indian society. But these select individuals were actually nominated members largely. And even when there was a voting, there was a small percentage of people who were voted into those positions. But the voting representation was very, very low. Only select voting was there. It is not general franchising. It was not a universal franchising. Therefore, these legislative assemblies were totally powerless. Even according to their constitution, the Viceroy was powerful, the assemblies were not. But even if the assembly makes a recommendation, Viceroy can rule it out. That was the constitution at that time. So there were attempts by the Indian leaders to improve education. One such attempt was done by Gopalakrishna Gokhale. In 1911, a Hindu representative, Gokhale, introduced a bill for universal compulsory education in India. It was defeated by the British and government appointed members. In 1916, Patel introduced a similar bill, I think it is Sardar Patel, which was defeated by the British and the government appointed members again. The total expenditure on education in India is less than one half the educational expenditure of New York State. Hence the 93% illiteracy of India. New York State is one out of the 50 states in the United States, and the population is far, far smaller. But Will Durant observes that the total expenditure on education in India is less than 50% of the educational expenditure in New York State. And the common public were faced with the choice of survival or education. From such poverty come ignorance, superstition, disease, and death. A people reduced to these straits cannot afford education. They cannot afford the taxes required to maintain adequate schools. They cannot afford to spare their children from productive employment during the years of public instruction. Every penny is taken from them that could have been used for proper education. When the British came, there was throughout India a system of communal schools, that is community schools, managed by the village communities. The agents of the East India Company destroyed these village communities and took no steps to replace the schools. Even today, after a century of efforts to restore them, that is by the British government, that is Macaulay's education system starting from 1835, they stand at only 22% of the number 100 years ago. There are now in India 7,30,000 villages and only 1,62,000 primary schools. Only 7% of the boys and 1.5% of girls receive schooling. That is 4% of the whole. Such schools as the government has established are not free, but exact a tuition fee, which, though small to a Western purse, looms large to a family always hovering on the edge of starvation. We have seen in the earlier presentation what was the state of poverty in Bengal. He says the whole house, including the clothing and other things, would be valued at less than $10. Now, instead of education, what the government was doing? This is Macaulay's rhetoric in the House of Commons in England. It was in 1833. Macaulay was speaking and he said that we will never do this. This is what he said in 1833. What is this? Encouraging opium. But then what they did in reality was quite different. Look at Macaulay's speech. It was the practice of miserable tyrants whom we found in India that when they dreaded the capacity and spirit of some distinguished subjects and yet could not venture to murder him, to administer to him daily dose of pausta, a preparation of opium, the effect of which was in a few months to destroy all the bodily and mental powers of the wretch who was drugged with it and turn him into a helpless idiot. That detestable artifice, more horrible than assassination itself, was worthy of those who employed it. It is no model for the English nation. We shall never consent to administer the posta for a whole community to stupefy and paralyze a great people. That is Macaulay's claim. But what was the reality? There was a lady by name Catherine Mayo. She came from US and she wrote a book on India. Durant comments on Catherine Mayo's book. This Mayo's book, Gandhiji commented on that as a gutter inspector's handbook on Catherine Mayo's book. This is what Gandhi described it as. Let us see what Durant has to say. The title of the book was Mother India. She does not tell us that the opium is grown only by the government and is sold exclusively by the government. That its sale, like the sale of drink through saloons, is carried on despite the protest of the Nationalist Congress and several others. That there are 7,000 opium shops in India operated by the British government in the most conspicuous places in every town. That the central legislature in 1921 passed a bill prohibiting the growth or sale of opium in India, and that the government refused to act upon it. That from 2 to 400,000 acres of India's soil, sorely needed for the raising of food, are given over to the growing of opium, and that the sale of the drug brings to the government 1/9 of its total revenue every year. Mind you, it is more than 10% revenue on opium alone. So one can imagine the quantity of opium that was produced. Continues, Durant continues. She does not tell us that Burma excluded opium by law until the British came and now overrun with it. That the British distributed it free in Burma to create a demand for it. England has refused at one world conference after another to reduce it in India. When Gandhi, by a peaceful anti-opium campaign in Assam, had reduced the consumption of the drug there by 1/2, the government put a stop to his labors and jailed 44 of his aides. She does not tell us that the health, courage, and character of the Hindu people have been undermined by this ruthless drugging of a nation by men pretending to be Christians. People like Macaulay. Instead of encouraging education, the government encouraged drink. When the British came, India was a sober nation. The temperance of the people, said Warren Hastings. Warren Hastings was the Governor General of East India Company in 1770 to 1784. The temperance of the people, said Warren Hastings, is demonstrated in the simplicity of their food and their total abstinence from spirituous liquors and other substances of intoxication. The East India Company made handsome profits from the trade of rum. When the Crown took over India, the license system was so arranged as to stimulate drinking and sales. The government revenue from such licenses has increased 7-fold in the last 40 years. In 1922, it stood at $60 million annually, 3 times the appropriation for schools and universities. 3 times the appropriation for schools and universities. Then use of ridicule, condemnation. Even Dharampalji has mentioned this. Ridicule is used as a tool to demean the entire nation. The final element in the real caste system of India, he identifies the caste system, not the Indian caste system. He says that there is a caste system under the British. He mentions many of them. He says the final element in the real caste system of India is the social treatment of the Hindus by the British. The latter may be a genial Englishman when they arrive, gentlemen famous as lovers of fair play from Britain. But they are soon turned by the example of their leaders and the poison of irresponsible power without responsibility, into the most arrogant and overbearing bureaucracy on earth. Nothing can be more striking, said a report to the parliament in 1830, than the scorn with which the people have been practically treated at the hands of even those who were actuated by the most benevolent motives. The result is a pitiful crushing of Hindu spirit, a stifling of its pride and growth, a stunting of genius once flourished in every city of the land. Have we felt that the Hindu character is degraded, that it lacks virility and initiative? But what people could have retained those qualities under such ruthless alien rule? In fact, that this observation of lacking in virility was made by the historian James Mill, whose book became a reference book for the Indian administrators. Subjection to a foreign yoke, says Professor Ross, is one of the most potent causes of the decay of nations. What is the consequence of this emasculation? People started reducing not only mentally but also physically. Said Charles Francis Adams, American historian, before the American Historical Association in 1901, there is not an instance in all recorded history where a so-called inferior race or community was elevated in character or made self-sustaining or self-governing or even put on the way to that result through a condition of dependency or tutelage. I might without much danger assert that the condition of dependency, even for communities of the same race and blood, always exercises an emasculating and deteriorating influence. I would undertake, if called upon, to show that this rule is invariable. A subjected country will reduce in virility, increase in decay, and lose its self-esteem, confidence, growth, and then will sink. famines. India was a land of wealth, land of prosperity, land of grains. Until the arrival of the British, until 1750, until nearly even 1770, India had never seen famines, never seen famines in the history of India. But it is during the last 3 centuries, that is starting from sometime in 1770 onwards, India started seeing famines. Not one or two, not one or two, more than 24 famines. In fact, 24 is a number quoted for the famines between 1850 to 1900. In 50 years, there were 24 famines. You can add a few more to that on either side. The same high rate of taxation which had led India to perhaps a mortal weakness might have done her no permanent injury if the wealth so taken had all been returned into the economy and circulation within the country, but was bodily withdrawn from her as so much of it was. It had acted like a long continued transfusion of vital blood. See, under the Mughal rule or even under the Pathan rule, the invaders came, occupied the seat of power, extracted the wealth from the public, but then they took away, like Ghazni Muhammad took away wealth from here. But then those who have settled here as sultans and as Mughal rulers, they expended it in India because this became their home also. So the money was taken from somebody, but then it was expended in the same society, and therefore other members of the society got this money, and therefore it was not drained out of the country, and the overall economy did not suffer so much. Even though it suffered, it would certainly suffer under foreign domination. It would suffer because the initiative of people is destroyed. Because it is the human effort that generates wealth out of money. So this wealth which has been, or the money which has been extracted from the public has been reused in the society. To that extent, it was within the society, and therefore the emasculation is not so much as it happened under the British rule. Under the British rule, the money was drained away to England from India. So it is like a continued transfusion of vital blood, says Will Durant. So great an economic drain out of the resources of the land, says R.C. Dutt, would impoverish the most prosperous countries on earth. It has reduced India to a land of famines, more frequent, more widespread, and more fatal than any known before the history of India or of the world. Mind you, or of the world. There are several high water marks under the British rule. One of them is famines. 24 major famines in 50 years. Famine had been a recurrent feature of life in the Indian subcontinental countries of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, most notoriously during the British rule. Famines in India resulted in more than 60 million deaths, 6 crore, over the course of 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Please remember this number. Somebody has calculated that during the Pathan rule, that is the Sultanate, Delhi Sultanate, starting from Muhammad Ghori and his Qutbuddin Aibak, his slave dynasty, followed by Tughlaq, Khilji, Lodi, etc. The first 300 years of this Pathan rule in India, number of people who perished in the war, onslaught upon the society, amounted to something like 8 crores. It may be more or less, it may not be an exact number, because in such computations, of course, it is rather approximate. But he's talking about 8 crores in 333 years. But under the British rule, famines alone took 6 crores of people in about 150, 200 years. Famines in British India were severe enough to have a substantial impact on the long-term population growth of the country in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The late 18th and 19th centuries saw an increase in the incidence of severe famine. The reason why I quoted 50 years period is only to show that the severity was more intense during this time. Millions died from 1850 to 1899 in 24 major famines, more than any other 50-year period, perhaps in the whole world of comparable, any area you take, compare it to the India, anywhere in the world, this kind of deaths did not happen. This is what Wikipedia says. I have listed some of them, not all the 24, but I've listed some 12 of them, which are among the more prominent famines. 1770 it started, the Great Bengal Famine, 10 million people perished. 1782, Chalisa Famine, around Delhi, Awadh, Punjab, 11 million people died. 88 and 94, see the frequency. 84 it had happened, 88 it again happened. Around Hyderabad, Maharashtra, etc. 11 million people died. 1837, Agra famine, 8 lakh people died. 1860, 2 million people died, 20 lakhs. 1866, Orissa, 1 million people died. Totally, if you total them, it is about 35.8 million in 6 of these famines, spread over about 100 years, 1770 to 1866. And here are 6 more, 1869, 73, 76, 96, 99, and then 1943, during the World War II, there was another famine, which took the life of about 3.6 million people. If you total these 6, it will add up to another 36 million people. So something like 72 million people died in 12 famines over the last 1 century. Look at the state of India. See, this is what drought is. This is what famine is. And this famine has affected the survivors even much later. This is called emaciation. The entire population was reduced in nutrition, in physical strength, ability, resistance to disease. India crumbled under this. Look at this. And will such a nation be able to fight the foreign domination? These are all photographs from 1896. This photograph, the earlier one's 1870, 76, 77. The consequence is disease and death. The emaciation of the Hindus sickens the traveler. Closed fingers can run. Closed fingers, that you can close your fingers, thumb and say the forefinger or the middle finger. Closed fingers can run up around their bare legs from the ankles to the knees. There is nothing called a calf muscle. In the cities, 34% of them are absent from work on any day. 34% is absent. Why? Because of illness or injury. They are too poor to afford foods rich in minerals and salts. They are too poor to buy fresh vegetables, much less to buy meat. The water supply, which is usually the first obligation of a government, is in primitive condition after a century or more of British rule. Dysentery and malaria have been eliminated from Panama and Cuba, but they flourish in British India. So this emaciation affected the entire population, not only select sections of the society, selected poor sections of society, the entire population. In fact, you might have noticed this trend. In my generation, I have noticed it, mine and the next generation. See, my generation, people are taller than their parents. I am taller than my father. And my next generation, my son is taller than me. My wife and her two sisters are taller than my mother-in-law. I have two sisters, both of them are taller than my mother. So if you see the generation, the average height of the population started increasing in free India. It will not keep on increasing, but then what is the normal standard? It was much less than that in the pre-independence days. This is emaciation because the nutrition was not available. So the physical size of the people itself started shrinking. As a child, I remember, I have not heard of pista or badam or things like that until I was 16. I have not eaten dates except 2 times until I was 16. Fruits were very rare at home. Naturally, the nutrition level was quite low. But the next generation was better off, so they grew taller than us. So this is called emaciation of the populace. The healthcare under the Raj was, once the Hindu was known to be among the cleanest of the clean. Even today, he bathes every morning and washes every morning the simple garment he wears. But the increase of poverty has made social sanitation impossible. Until 1918, the total expenditure on public health of both the central and provincial governments combined was only $5 million a year for the 240 million people, an appropriation of 2 cents per capita. 2 cents. 2 cents on health care per individual per year. Sir William Hunter, once the Director General of Indian Statistics, estimated that 40 million of the people of India were seldom or never able to satisfy their hunger. 40 million people of India. Weakened with malnutrition, they offer low resistance to infections. Epidemics periodically destroy millions of them. In 1901, 272,000 people died of plague introduced from abroad. In 1902, 5 million people died of plague. In 1903, 8 lakh people. In 1904, 1 million people. In 1918, there were 125 million cases of influenza and 12.5 million recorded deaths because of influenza. That is 1.25 crores died because of this influenza. We can now understand why there are famines in India. Their cause in plain terms is not the absence of sufficient food. Not the absence of sufficient food. Food production had come down because vast stretches of land was not cultivated. This is due to the taxation policy. But says Durand, it was not the inadequacy of food. It is not the absence of sufficient food, but the ability of the people to pay for it. It is poverty, not slackness of food or shortage of food. Famines have increased in frequency and severity under the British rule from 1770 to 1900. 25 million Hindus died of starvation alone. 15 million of these died in the last quarter of the century. In the famines of 1877, 89, 97, and 1900, 15 million people died. Of these died in the last quarter of the century in the famines of 1877 to 1900. Contemporary students estimate that 8 million will die of starvation in India during the present year. 8 million. Behind all these terrible famines in India lies such merciless exploitation, such unbalanced exportation of goods, and such brutal collection of high taxes in the very midst of famine, that the starving peasants cannot pay what is asked for the food that the railways are bringing them. See, the railways were able to transport food, but people were not able to buy them. American charity has often paid for the relief of famine in India, while the government was collecting taxes from the dying. There has never been a single year, says R.C. Dutt, when the food supply of the country was insufficient for the people. What is it that was insufficient? Money to buy those things, those foodstuffs, was insufficient. The obvious fact stares us in the face. This is President of the Union Theological Seminary, Dr. Charles Hall, says. The obvious fact that stares us in the face, there is at no time, in no year, any shortage of foodstuffs in India. The trouble is that the taxes imposed by the British government being 50% of the produce, the Indian starves that India's annual revenue may not be diminished by $1. 80% of the whole population has been thrown back upon the soil because England's discriminating duties have ruined practically every branch of native manufacture. So people fall back on the land, but the land does not produce enough. Sorry, it produces enough, but people have sunk to a level of poverty that they cannot buy it. We send shiploads of grain to India, but there is plenty of grain in India. The trouble is that the people have been ground down till they are too poor to buy it. Famine is chronic there now. The same drainage of millions of dollars goes on every year in the form of taxes to England. This is an American citizen, the president of Theological Seminary is saying this. The final item is death rate. In England, the death rate is 13 per 1,000 per year. 13 people perish out of 1,000 in a year. In United States, it is 12. In India, it is 32. Roughly 3 times. Half the children born in Bengal die before reaching the age of 8. In a recent year, in 1921, the infant mortality in Bombay was 666 per thousand, 2/3 of children. Lieutenant Colonel Dunn of the Indian Medical Service says that 1/2 of the death rate is preventable. If we doubt this, we need only to study the case of Cuba, which under the Spanish rule was ridden with malaria, typhus, and cholera, and had one of the world's highest death rate, while now, under freedom, it is one of the healthiest of countries. But in India, if 10 are born, 3 or 6 or 8 of them may die within 1 year. So it is the conclusion of the play. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So this is the conclusion of the play. Taxation, exploitation, starvation, and death. Now this is the economic front, the education front, the famine front, the healthcare front. But now let us look at the political front. The divide and rule was the policy of the British Raj, very clearly and explicitly so after 1857. Because during 1857, the uprising was against the British East India Company, and it was a formidable challenge for the East India Company to suppress that. So then they decided on a policy of divide and rule. Lieutenant Colonel John Coke, commandant at Moradabad, advised the British government shortly before it took over India from the company. In 1858, the British government took over the country from East India Company. So Lieutenant Colonel John Coke's advice was, our endeavor should be to uphold in full force the separation which exists between the different religions and races, not to endeavor to amalgamate them. Divide et impera, that is divide and rule, should be the principle of Indian government. To rule your subjects, divide them. Lord Falkland, the British governor of Bombay, in 1859, sent to his government this word of counsel. He said, divide et impera was the old Roman motto, and it should be ours. See, this is the time they took over, and then the policy was getting frozen. 1858, 1859, that is the time period. Sir John Strachey, British India civil servant, he wrote, the existence side by side of hostile creeds among the Indian people is one of the strong points in our political position in India. And this policy greatly succeeded, wrecking our freedom movement and finally, of course, dividing the country. Josie Wedgwood was a British member of parliament, said of the reforms, the very idea of India vanished from the bill to be replaced by the disunited communities of Hindus, Muslim, Sikh, Maratha, Brahmin, non-Brahmin, Indian Christian, Anglo-Indian and English. See, they introduced what is known as separate electorates. They said we have a legislative assembly for which we want to elect the members. But this election was done community-wise. A particular community will vote a representative. Therefore, communities are divided. This community will have so many representatives, you elect them and send. And that community will have so many representatives, you elect them and send. It is not that the common citizenry which elects a representative.
Like that, like this. We should draw it. And what are the
So separate electorates was a political wedge driven between the various communities in India so that people nurture their separate identities. In fact, even Anglo-Indians had representatives. Their number were very, very less compared to, say the Hindus or Muslims or Sikh or others. But they had seats allocated in the parliament. And this continued even after independence. In fact, Free India until several decades later had Anglo-Indian representatives in the parliament. It was claimed that such a plan was necessary to protect the Muslims from the Hindus, but who outnumber them almost 5 to 1. In practice, however, it is the Hindus who need protection from the Muslims. This is the observation of Will Durant. The actual result was the increasing division of India into a score of mutually hostile groups. Now the colonial grip. When England was in difficulty, you have seen this, England used Indian forces to fight the battle for the company and the battle for the British government. There were 110, 111 wars that took place during the 19th century. In almost all of them were fought by the British Indian soldiers. That means the Indians were working for the British as mercenary soldiers. They won the war, they ruled the land using and spilling the Indian blood for the victory, for their land. And then the wars were paid for by the Indian tax. So the money of the land and the people of the land both were used by the British to gain control over the whole country. This is the meaning of a colony. And certainly they would not like to leave this and go. But when there were difficult times, such as the First World War, they almost promised that we'll give you something precious, something valuable, something that you will be happy about. But once the war was over, they changed. They reverted back to their earlier policy. See how they manipulated. The Indian National Congress was born in 1885 under the leadership of Evo Hume, who conceived this body as a platform for supplication to the British rulers, British government. He brought in several Indian leaders upon this platform, but the purpose was actually supplication. Supplication means plead for some crumbs of office. Says Durant. In 1885, a few Hindu leaders met at Bombay and founded the Indian National Congress. But they do not seem at that time to have dreamed even of home rule. Those leaders were mostly of the middle and business class. They accepted a British rule in India as they accepted the behavior of the sun in the sky. That is very natural, very normal kind of approach. They recognized many benefits in that rule. What they wanted was not independence, but a share in the government, its dignities, its powers, and perhaps its spoils. The British office holders could not understand this point of view. They froze the movement with cold stares and references to the future. Okay, we shall see type of thing. They did not discourage them wholly because it is an emotional outlet for many people, and the outlet is in a supplication mode, and therefore it is not that dangerous. So they allowed this to flourish, but did not give anything substantial. Viceroy Lord Curzon proclaimed in 1905 his intention to partition Bengal. The idea of partition was actually to separate the Hindus and Muslims. In fact, the area which we call as Bangladesh today was a Muslim-dominated area, and the West Bengal was a Hindu-dominated area. So he divided the two so that they feel separate. The same kind of tactics was adopted in the independent India. In Kerala, there is a district called Malappuram, which was separated out of Calicut because it is a Muslim-dominated area. So Curzon decided to partition Bengal. In 1905, he announced, which the purpose of which was clearly understood by the Indian leadership. So they revolted against it. They took processions against it. They made speeches against it. They raised the Swadeshi movement against it. And there was a huge movement. But he went ahead and partitioned, thereby destroying the unity and strength of the most conscious and powerful community in India. The result was the development of a more rebel mood and the appearance of blunt leaders like the uncompromising Tilak, who at the All India National Congress of 1905 announced to the excited delegates that India must have Swaraj. He had created the word out of Sanskrit roots, still visible in English translation as self-rule or home rule. This was in 1905, and the Swadeshi movement gained momentum. Tilak was imprisoned to Mandale. He was shifted to Burma. So the British Raj was able to crush this movement. But by 1914, Mahatma Gandhi arrived from South Africa, and he became the darling of the masses, and the whole of India followed Gandhi, or at least the vocal India, the active India, politically sensitive India. accepted Mahatma Gandhi as their leader. With the arrival of Gandhi in 1914 and the outbreak of the World War I, the situation changed. Gandhi, the idealist, did not realize that the subjection of India was the root of the war. See, this is a historian's comment. The cause of the war, one of the causes, one of the roots of the war was the Indian colony under the British rule. But Gandhi did not realize. See, British wanted to hold on to India, but Gandhi did not realize this trick. This is called realpolitik. Gandhi did not realize that, so he supported the British in the war efforts. And the British government made promises that it would give something precious after the war if you support us. See how it worked. Gandhi, the idealist, did not realize that the subjection of India was one root of the war. That this had for a century, that is the Indian colony, for a century determined British policy. And the size of the British Navy, as well as the size of all the navies of the world. Instead, Gandhi saw the war as an opportunity for securing home rule by providing the absolute loyalty of India to England. He thought England will gift it to you at the end of the war. From the beginning to the end of the great madness called war, he supported the Allies and India followed him. She, that is India, contributed at once $500 million to the fund for prosecuting the war. This is British Indian government, of course, but the taxpayers' money, a huge sum was contributed to the war effort. Of course, they will replenish their coffers after taxing the Indian public again. She contributed $700 million later in subscriptions to war loans. And she sent to the Allies various products to the value of $1.25 billion. The suspension of the revolutionary movement by the Indian National Congress or others, suspension of the revolutionary movement enabled England to reduce the Indian army to 15,000 men. But in the normal times, British Raj had something like 68,000 forces in India. It is compared to the population of India, it is still less. 68,000 means it is one British soldier for 10 villages of India. But now it has reduced almost to 15,000 men. They could mobilize their forces to the war front. The total number of Hindus who were persuaded, often by means amounting to compulsion, it is a combination of compulsion as well as persuasion, to fight for England in the war was, notice the number, it is 1 million, that is 13.38 lakhs of people fought for England, Indian citizens, Indians, 13.38 lakhs of people fought in the First World War. Being 1.78 lakhs more than all the troops contributed by the combined dominions of the Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, which were under the British. So India was the most prominent contributor for the First World War under the British rule. But None of the Hindu soldiers was granted a commission. Almost all these 13.38 lakhs of soldiers were only soldiers, no officers. However brave he might have proved himself to be, yet they gave a good account of themselves in France, in Palestine, in Syria, and in Mesopotamia. A British historian speaks of the brilliant performance of the Indian contingent sent to France in 1914 at a critical time in the Great War. And during this period, the First World War was between 1914 to 1918, 4 years. And as it usually happens in a World War, there are ups and downs, and there were critical times. Indeed, in 1917, in the middle of the war, when the position of England in the war was critical, and enthusiasm for the cause of democracy needed stimulation, Mr. Edwin Montego, Secretary of State for India in the British government, made the following announcement in the House of Commons, that the policy of His Majesty's government, with which the government of India is in complete accord, is that the increasing association of Indians in every branch of the administration and the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire. See, this last clause is a little tricky, but on the whole, the first 4/5 of the sentence, making a policy statement, talks about self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India. By responsible, we mean the representative government, that is democratic government in India, as an integral part of the British Empire. They have not lifted the yoke completely, but this is a policy of the government, they said. They have decided that substantial steps in this direction should be taken as soon as possible. This is another tricky statement, as soon as possible. But apparently, Mr. Montego was a sincere person, or more sincere than others. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Montego visited India, and in collaboration with the Viceroy, Lord Chelmsford, drew up the reforms known by their names. It is called Montego-Chelmsford Award or something like that. Reforms. The secretary wished to carry out his promises liberally, but the Viceroy proved to be an obstinate conservative. These things might do, he said, a generation or two hence. He postponed this promise, or the intent of the promise, to 2 generations later, which means another 25 years, which means never. Nor did the government in London encourage Montego. He was the representative of the government, but the rest of the government did not. Once the war was over, the British government in Britain regretted the secretary's promise and sought devices and phrases that would break it while seeming to keep it. Lloyd George, then Premier, declared with unstatesmanlike clarity that Britain intended always to rule India, that there must always remain in India a steel frame of British power and British dominance. So once the war is over, they change their stand. sometime previously, maybe 1912, Lord Curzon had written. Because Curzon was, he divided, partition of Bengal was done in 1905. And I think he retired from as a viceroy from India in 1912. So it must be around 1912. British rule of the Indian people is England's present and future task. It will occupy her energies for as long a span of the future as it is humanly possible to forecast. He said it will never end. Lord Birkenhead, Lord High Chancellor means the highest civil servant in the British government. Lord Birkenhead was to say in 1925, I am not able in any foreseeable future to discern a moment when we may safely, either to ourselves or India, abandon our trust. He's talking about the trust which the Indian public have laid upon India and the Indian public laid upon the British leadership laid upon the Indian public. This mutual trust cannot be broken. As far as the trust continues, we'll continue to rule. The last word observed the best traditions of imperialistic hypocrisy. They will use the words like trust for what they do in India. But whatever the reforms were announced, they were of this kind. The reforms fell short of what Montagu had hoped for. They established first the system of monarchy, by which each province would have two ministries, one responsible to the provincial legislature and having no powers of any account, the other responsible only to the British authorities and having all the fundamental powers. What this would essentially mean is that ministries are only tools of implementation. So there are two ministries, one for the legislature, one for the viceroy. The viceroy has all the powers, or the governor has all the powers, the legislature has no powers. This happened both in provinces as well as in the center. Any act of the provincial legislature could be overruled by the governor. And any act of the governor, if he considered it necessary to the interest of the empire, could be passed by decree over the heads of the legislature. A similar arrangement castrated the Central Assembly at the viceroy's level. Here too, the only right was to speak. You can stand up in the legislature and speak. That right was granted, but nothing beyond that. The authority remained with the viceroy. He was empowered to enact any measure which might seem necessary to him, even if it must be over a unanimous adverse vote of the assembly. He could collect taxes which the assembly had refused to vote. He controlled the expenditures, taxation and defense, and was free to pay salaries and pensions denied by the assembly. When this remarkable form of progressive self-government reached England, progressive self-government, they said, a member of the parliament, Dr. Rutherford, said of it, never in the history of the world was such a hoax perpetrated upon a great people as England perpetrated upon India. This is a British member of the parliament saying. When in return for India's invaluable service during the war, we gave to the Indian nation such a discreditable, disgraceful, undemocratic, tyrannical constitution. You may remember, see, this never in the history of the world. See these superlatives. You also see the superlatives on the other side. Never in the history of mankind where the riches that has flown from India to England, which was described by Gladstone. He was the Chancellor of Exchequer, that is the Finance Minister of British government in 1863 during his budget speech, which you have quoted earlier. He says, I should look almost with apprehension and with pain upon this intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power. He says that British people are intoxicated by wealth and power. If it were my belief that it was confined to the class who are in easy circumstances, only thing he's saying is that it is not confined to the upper class of British society, but it is also given to, the share is given to the labor class. He added, the average condition of the British laborer, we have the happiness to know, has improved during the last 20 years in a degree which we know to be extraordinary and which we may almost pronounce to be unexampled in the history of any country of any age. On the one side, it is the intoxicating wealth and power that was drained from India to England. On the other side, it is the never in the history of the world such a hoax was perpetrated upon India. The reforms. Against the reforms, no Hindu could do anything except protest by tongue or pen. But that was a right not guaranteed to him. He can't even speak. The reforms did not ensure to the Hindus freedom of speech or of assembly or of the press or the right of trial in open court or the privilege of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus means if a person is arrested, the police is supposed to produce him before a magistrate within 24 hours. And if they don't, then the family or friends of the person arrested can seek this through the court of law that he should be produced, his whereabouts should be known. But the reforms had suspended this right to habeas corpus. That means people can be arrested and taken away without any reasons, and they need not be produced before any magistrate or a court of law at any time. This was one of the contentions during the emergency 1975 to 77 in India under Mrs. Gandhi's rule. This habeas corpus was suspended. Or any other of the essential rights and privileges which are the foundations and indispensable guarantees of liberty, justice, and law. When protests were tried and the Hindu press began to voice its suspicion that India had been deceived, the government at Delhi issued in 1919 the Rowlatt Act, reimposing upon India all those restrictions of the assembly, press, and speech that had been in effect during the war. During the war, emergency would be declared, and all these rights of free speech and assembly and protest, etc., are suspended. Now the war was over and the reforms were introduced which had no substance at all. When the people started protesting, started feeling that it is a deception, In 1919, the Rowlatt Act, the wartime suspension, was reenacted by the British Raj. It is named after the judge who recommended that the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act of 1919, popularly known as the Rowlatt Act, was a legislative council act passed by the Imperial Legislative Council in Delhi on the 18 March 1919, indefinitely extending the emergency measures of preventive indefinite detention, incarceration without trial and judicial review. Without trial and judicial review, enacted in the Defense of India Act 1915 during the First World War. What was initially passed in 1915 during the war was been reimposed in March 2019, 1919. 1919. The British government passed the Rowlatt Act, which gave powers to the police to arrest any person without any reason whatsoever. The purpose of the act was to curb the growing nationalist upsurge in the country. Gandhi called upon the people to do satyagraha against such oppressive act. It is these provisions of the act are probably drawn from the Spanish Inquisition. We have seen Inquisition offers this kind of authority to the Holy Office under the Roman Catholic Church. The acts proclaimed that hereafter the government might arrest without notice or warrant any suspected person and detain him without trial as long as it liked. That such a trial as might be given was to be in secret. It was not an open trial. Before not a jury but 3 judges appointed by the government. Even this 3 number is drawn from the Inquisition. That the accused need not be told the names of his accusers. They can arrest on the basis of suspicion or based on a complaint by any accuser. But the person who arrested need not be told who was the complainant, nor of the witnesses against him. The conduct of the inquiry, it is not open. The accused will not be present in the court when the jury or the judges examine the witness, and the accused need not be told who are these witnesses whom have given evidence against him. That these should not be required to confront him. That the accused must not be allowed the right of engaging a lawyer to defend him. That he must not call witnesses on his behalf. See, this right to engage a lawyer is one of the fundamental requirements of a judicial process. Even terrorists who are responsible for mass murder are given a lawyer. If they don't have resources to engage a lawyer, then the court provides him a lawyer to present, through whom he can present his case. But here it is suspended. That he must not call witnesses in his behalf. He cannot cite somebody else to say that, no, I was not here, but I was with him. You cannot call him to his help. That usual legal procedures might be abrogated and that no appeal would be permitted. Completely draconian, you can say. An Indian scholar showed that these were almost precisely the rules of the Spanish Inquisition, says Will Durant. And this, they call it as the rule of law. Divide rule. If they are likely to awaken and question you and seek more authority, more participation in the government, deny it and use the Rowlatt Act against such people. Now further, this is an example of the rule of law. In fact, Baldwin, the de facto Prime Minister of Britain in 1929, in a speech, he said, "Oh, we have given the rule of law to India. We are not going to give them freedom now because we have established a rule of law there, and step by step, slowly, we will give them power." This is what he's saying in 1929. The kind of law. See, what is the law? The kind of the rule. At Amritsar in 1919, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. The last blow was the massacre of Amritsar. See, the Rowlatt Act was invoked in March, I think March 10th or so of 1919. This is a month later, just a month later. The last blow was the massacre of Amritsar. Meetings were held to protest against the Rowlatt Act. And on March 30th and April 6th, 1919, hartals were successfully declared. April 6th. There was no disorder, says an English clergyman resident in India, and Europeans passed unmolested among the crowds. It was a fine sample of non-violent non-cooperation. Gandhiji had asked for satyagraha and people offered satyagraha. That was April 6th. On April 9th, two leaders of the satyagraha, the non-violent movement, Dr. Saifuddin Kitliu and Dr. Satyapal, they were called by the district collector for a meeting in his office. And they went there unsuspecting, but they were arrested using Rowlatt's Act and deported to, I think, Dharmashala in Himachal Pradesh. On the 9th of April, the government arrested Doctors Kitlu and Satyapal, who had addressed the protest meetings. When word of this spread, a great crowd poured into the streets. Part of it tried to force its way through the police lines to register with the deputy commissioner their protest against the arrest of the leaders. Some in the crowd threw stones at the police. The police answered with bullets, and 10 men were killed. Infuriated by the sight of these dead, the crowd lost all order and destroyed property and killed 5 Englishmen. A woman missionary was set upon and beaten, but was carried to safety by some Hindus. Indians of education tried to pacify the crowd but failed. Indian officers in the city volunteered their services to the government. This was 9th April. On the 10th and 11th, 600 troops arrived. The Lieutenant Governor General Dyer, General O'Dyer, Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, ordered the troops to arrive, which was headed by Brigadier General Dyer. One was O'Dyer, another is Dyer. On the 10th and 11th, 600 troops arrived. On the 12th, Brigadier General Dyer came and took command. By that day, quiet had been restored, and such crowds as gathered were peacefully dispersed. General Dyer made several arrests And on the 13th, he summoned the people by call of drums and had read to them a proclamation forbidding them to leave the city without a pass, or to organize processions, or to gather in groups of more than three. Meanwhile, on the same day, 10,000 Hindus from outlying districts who had little, if any, knowledge of this proclamation collected in the enclosure known as Jallianwala Bagh and proceeded to celebrate the religious festival, Baishakhi, the day in 1699, Guru Gobind Singh had formed the Khalsa Panth. So it's a sacred day, it's a festive day. So 10,000 people had gathered in Jallianwala Bagh. And the Bagh was an extinct garden and surrounded with high walls on every side and entered by a few narrow passages. The wicket gates were few. The main gate was very narrow. It was an enclosed ground. So General Dyer, the brigadier general who commanded these troops, proceeded to the spot with a detachment of troops, 90 people, 2 armored vehicles, equipped with Lewis machine guns and armored cars. Entering the Bagh, he could not take this vehicle inside because the entrance was narrow. So he disembarked and took his soldiers inside. Entering the Bagh, he saw the crowd and concluded that it had met in violation of his orders. Without giving the slightest warning or affording the assemblage any opportunity to indicate its pacific intentions, he ordered his troops to fire upon the imprisoned mass. And though the crowd made no resistance, but shouted its horror and despair, and pressed in panic against the gates, the general ordered the firing to continue until all the ammunition the soldiers had brought with them was exhausted. The firing continued for 11 minutes and hundreds were dead. General Dyer personally directed the firing towards the exits where the crowd was most dense. The targets, he declared, were good. The massacre lasted for over 10 minutes. When it was over, 1,500 Hindus were left on the ground, 400 of them dead. This is a modest estimation. Later on, Congress team visited and estimated the number of casualties much larger. Dyer forbade his soldiers to give any aid to the injured. And by ordering all Hindus off the streets for 24 hours curfew, prevented relatives or friends from bringing even a cup of water to the wounded who were piled up in the field. General Dyer issued an order that Hindus using the street in which the woman missionary had been beaten should crawl on their bellies. Even now it is called the crawling lane. People, whoever is passing through the street, had to pass in crawling, their bellies touching the ground. If they tried to rise to all fours, they were struck by the butts of soldiers' guns. The news of this barbaric orgy of military sadism was kept from the world for half a year. A belated commission of inquiry appointed by the government rendered an equivocal report. A committee appointed by the Indian National Congress made a more thorough investigation and reported 1,200 killed and 3,600 wounded. General Dyer was censured by the House of Commons, exonerated, and was retired on a pension. Thinking this reward insufficient, the militaries of the empire raised a fund of $150,000 for him and presented him with a jeweled sword of honor. And this man retired from the military in 1927. But the other man, the person above him, General Michael O'Dwyer, who was the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab in 1919. He lived until 1940, until Sardar Udham Singh, who was present in the Jallianwala Bagh, inside the Bagh, a 20-year-old youth in 1919, who had come as a volunteer because Sardar Udham Singh was an orphan. He was raised by the orphanage, the Khalsa orphanage. So he had come there to offer water to the assembly, the Karseva, which they usually do. He was present at the time of massacre. So he was deeply hurt and he pursued General Michael O'Dwyer for 21 years. And at the end of that, he met him in England, where he shot him dead. Sardar Udham Singh shot General Michael O'Dwyer at a joint meeting of the East India Association and the Central Asian Society at Caxton Hall, London, on March 13, 1940. Udham Singh did not flee from the spot and was arrested for the killing. During his trial, Udham Singh said he had waited 21 years to kill General Michael O'Dwyer, who justified the massacre as the correct action, who wanted to crush the spirit of my people, so I crushed him, he said. Udham Singh was hanged 4 months later, and his mortal remains were handed over to India in 1974. I remember when it was brought to India in 1974. So this is what the rule of law under the British, which they refused to vacate. They vacated it after another war, and that too not because of the peaceful movement. They don't understand that. They vacated later, as Prime Minister Attlee stated, that the Indian armed forces had lost faith in the British masters because of the INA movement, Netaji's INA movement. The Indian soldiers working for the British and in the British army, they lost faith in the British masters. So they were about to turn around and fire at them. So they vacated and went back to England. But while going, they divided the country and went. So now the final statement of Will Durant on the whole of 200 years of British rule. He says, I came to India admiring the British, marveling at their imperial capacity for establishing order and peace in the world, across the world, and thankful for the security which their policing of world's waters have given to every traveler. They had a powerful navy, globally connected navy, and they made the sea passage safe against the pirates. So thankful to the security which their policing of world's waters have given to every traveler. I left India feeling that feeling its awful poverty is an unanswerable indictment of its alien government. The British ownership of India has been a calamity and a crime. The present plunder now has gone on beyond bearing. Year by year, it is destroying one of the greatest and gentlest peoples of history. Any man who sees this crime and does not speak out is a coward. Any Englishman or an American seeing it and not revolted by it does not deserve his country or his name. That is what Will Durant had to say. There are a few references. The second book, J.T. Sunderland, was published in 1928, India in Bondage. This book was banned by the British government in India. And the third one is R.C. Dutt, a brilliant economist who wrote the economic history of India in 2 volumes, published in 1903. One was before the Victorian period and another is during the Victorian period. Yes, so this is the end of part 2. The book is not complete. There are 2 more chapters in the book, but this is the end of part 2. If there are any comments or questions, I would like to hear. Thank you for your listening. If there are any comments, please.
Yeah, I guess whoever wants to ask a question can unmute themselves.
No questions?
No particular comments. Thank you for the session.
Yeah.
Although we have been discussing this before as well, but every time we hear, it actually refreshes us.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Shanti Mantra.
Yes.
We'll have Shanti Mantra.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sarve bhavantu sukhinah. Sarve santu niramaya. Sarve bhadrani pashyantu. Ma kaschid dukkha bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
There's a